It was April 3rd, 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Martin Luther King and his followers from his organization went into the city to do nonviolent direct action, to bring to light the inequalities that the black Americans were suffering at that time, and try to help further the civil rights cause. A week later, after 7 days of protesting and sit-ins and demonstrations, an injunction was ordered to stop all parades and demonstrations. Dr. King made it clear that he was not going to abide by that injunction. So he and several of his followers were arrested and put in jail. 2 days later, 8 white pastors from the Birmingham area put a notice in the newspaper. It was a call to unity, asking that black men and women have patience, that they wait just a little bit longer, that equality and inequality generally has a way of working itself out. And certainly there was no need to bring in outside influences, a thinly veiled criticism of Dr. King. The newspaper that it appeared in was taken to Dr. King in jail. And on April 13th, he began to write a response, which became one of his greatest works, a letter from a Birmingham jail. In that letter, he said, "Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, 'Wait.' But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your brothers and sisters at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse and kick and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of the 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that was just advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see those ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, 'Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?' Or when you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes the N-word and your middle name becomes boy and your last name becomes John and your wife and your mother are never given the respected title of Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at a tiptoe stance, plagued with the inner fears and the outer resentments, when you are forever fighting degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait." Those were his words of frustration from that jail in Birmingham. Dr. King at that point was the de facto leader of the civil rights movement. He was trying to steer the frustrations of the black national community toward nonviolent direct actions as opposed to violently lashing out and causing bloodshed on both sides. For his nonviolent action and peaceful demonstrations, King became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And today, we look forward to the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, which will come tomorrow in our nation. It is a day that is a reminder of the stain that racism is on our national fabric. As beautiful as our tapestry is, with its freedoms and its equalities and its prosperity, there are stains, dark stains, like the stain of racism, that should be remembered. But Martin Luther King Day is also about celebrating. It is about the celebration of those men and women, black and white, who brought to light the injustices that were facing our country and nation at that time and forced our leaders to understand our most endearing declarations of independence. That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The early 1960s civil rights movement was a tumultuous time in America for every sector, from politics to academia to labor to social, even religious. Today, it's difficult for those who did not live through that to imagine a time when racism wasn't a blight, to imagine a time when the majority of white Americans treated black Americans with disdain and hatred. It is hard to imagine a time when racism was the norm and not the exception. But against this backdrop, we have to ask the question, where was the church? The majority of Christians were nowhere to be found. Sadly, during the 19th century abolition movement and the 20th century civil rights movement, they couldn't be found. You couldn't look around and say, oh, well, there's a member of the church defending, or there's a member that there were simply not that many there. Sadly, the church either bought into and defended segregation and racism, or it remained silent about it. And it put many Christians on the wrong side of history. The wrong side of history. That's an interesting phrase. Meaning that as a society looks back with hindsight of 2020, there are certain moral issues where people fought on both sides of the issue. And now, with the moral clarity that we have today, we can tell who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side. Eugenics, a good beginning, was a science and a discipline that sought to breed out inferior human qualities, inferior races, inferior intelligence, inferior looks. And the idea was that we were going to have a new beginning of humanity, taken to its fullest extent in Nazism, which said we've got to begin with a cleansing of all of those who are undesirable. And then we can breed the proper Aryan race. It's one of the saddest times in the world's history. And yet, when we look back, there were some on the right side and some on the wrong side of the eugenics issue. Other issues like evolution and concentration camps and communism and polygamy and gender equality and slavery. We can look back in hindsight on some of these and see immediately who was right and who was wrong. Knowing what is morally right today concerning slavery and concerning racism and segregation, it behooves us as Christians to see which side of history the church fought on. Where were we? While the churches of Christ are composed of autonomous congregations, and certainly there were some congregations on one side of the segregation issue and other congregations on the other side of that issue. The question is, where were the majority? Where were the loudest voices? What were they fighting for in the United States of America? Sadly, as we look back history and the evidence, it points that the church was on the wrong side. David Lipscomb, co-founder of the Gospel Advocate magazine, an editor beginning in 1865 at the paper's inception after the Civil War. He was a proponent of silence. Not that he necessarily wanted segregation or that he owned slaves or anything. He was just a proponent of silence. That the church had no business meddling in political affairs. But that silence that he was talking about led to a foundation that the church used for generations to keep hands off and allow inequality and hatred to grow and prosper. Several of the pioneer preachers of the American Restoration movement owned slaves. They, in the midst of the Civil War and the rising tensions between North and South and the slavery issue, many of them stayed silent. Some of them, not wanting their own slaves, sold their slaves in an effort to alleviate their own personal guilt, and yet to understand that those slaves remained slaves in other people's households. It didn't alleviate anything. Many during that time of the late 1850s and 1860s began to buy into Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories, which itself leads to and lends to the entire racial argument. His now famous book, The Origin of the Species, is often abbreviated in its title because we don't want to know what Darwin actually believed. The full title of his book, On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races. Someone might come along and say, well, he just means the different species of life. No. In his book, Descent of Man, Darwin makes it clear and explains that the different races reflected different stages of the evolutionary process, and that the white race was more advanced than darker-skinned races which were closer to their ape and monkey ancestors. They were less evolved to a point that throughout the book and throughout his life, Darwin referred to them as savages because they were closer to the animals that he believed they evolved from than the white race was. Many rejected his theory, believing in the church, believing in creation, but they still accepted the idea that darker-skinned races were inferior to the white race. In the 1940s, a tract came out written by a preacher by the name of White, ironically, in which he advocated the segregation of races, that the white race and the black race should not mix. The black can have their homes, they can have their churches, they can have their businesses, but they couldn't come into the white areas and the white arenas, and the white would have all of their own, and they wouldn't go into the black arenas. Sadly, he was not the only one who was preaching such things from the pulpit. They tried to lay a foundation of truth by going to Genesis chapter 9 and relating to the curse of Ham, or the curse of Canaan, in which Ham had seen his father's nakedness. And when Noah woke up, he cursed Ham because of what he had done. They believed that curse on Ham, because he eventually settled in Africa and became the race of black people, that curse of Genesis 9 remains upon the black race today. That was a major sentiment in the churches of Christ from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And then Foy E. Wallace Jr., a giant in the Church of Christ, the leader against premillennialism, nearly single-handedly drove the idea of premillennialism and the false doctrines of rapture theory out of the church, who was an editor of the Gospel Advocate from 1930 to 1934. Even after he was no longer the editor of the Advocate, he was a prolific writer, producing several books that are still in many preachers' libraries today. A man who was well respected, and yet he was a very staunch segregationist, a racist to his very core. In one article that he had published in the Bible Banner in March of 1941, Wallace says, "Reliable reports have come to me of white women, members of the church, becoming so animated over a certain colored preacher as to go up to him after a sermon and shake his hand, and with him holding his hand in both of theirs. That kind of thing will turn the head of most white preachers and sometimes affect their conduct. And anybody ought to know that it will make fools out of the Negroes. For any woman in the church to so far forget her dignity and lower herself so just because a Negro has learned enough about the gospel to preach it to his race is pitiable indeed." No, Brother Wallace, your attitude was pitiable indeed. Many in the churches of Christ bought into that mentality. But there were a few shining lights. Wallace's article makes reference to a young white preacher who had a black preacher stay with him. And because he didn't have an extra bed, they ended up sleeping in the same bed together. They were applauding it, and of course Wallace was condemning it, saying that that white preacher should know his place. That preacher was Ira Rice. Ira Rice was one who looked past race, who didn't consider skin color. And it took him all over the United States of America into many countries doing mission work, especially in Far East Asia. Other men like G.P. Bowser and R.N. Hogan were black preachers who were very vocal about the inequalities and the need to recognize that the black man was your brother, that he was not of an inferior race, but that we were all equal, needing the same things. Not long ago, I had an opportunity to have lunch with John DeBerry, minister of the church. The question was asked how he continues to be elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives, seeing as many of the bills that he sponsors and many of the views that he holds are contrary to popular beliefs. And he said, "My father marched with Dr. King. And as long as people remember my name and my father's name, I will continue to be elected." There were shining lights in the church, but brethren, they were few and very far between. Some of you may recall America before the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement, or even immediately after the Civil Rights Movement. And you may remember hearing sermons backing one side or the other. But I suspect that most may only recall a deafening silence on the issue of segregation and racism. We were on the wrong side of history. But great strides have been made in the church and in society. And while racism may survive in small pockets and back corners, most Americans are embarrassed by the racial conflicts of the past. Today, racism is largely and rightly viewed as immoral and intolerable. And the church is largely follows that trend, not because it is culturally trendy, but because it is morally right. Because racism is sinful. You see, racism, which says one race is inferior based upon the skin tone color that they have, it denies our common ancestry, that we all have descended from the prime couple, Adam and Eve. We have a common origin by the creation of the hand of God through Adam and Eve to what we have today, the varied, beautiful colors of skin of humanity. Racism denies that common ancestry, buys into this idea of evolution. Racism reflects an attitude of partiality or that respecter of persons. Peter says, "Truly, I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." Acts 10:34 and 35. Peter, are you trying to say that people in the Jewish nation that believe are acceptable to God? Absolutely. Peter, are you saying that people in the Roman nation that obey God and believe in him will be acceptable to God? Absolutely. Peter, are you saying that people in Ethiopia, people in Nigeria, people in the darkest forests of Africa, that if they will believe in God and do what is right, God will accept them regardless of the color of their skin? Absolutely. God is not a respecter of persons, Paul would write in Romans 2 and verse 11. James makes it clear in James 2, beginning in verse 8, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That he calls the royal law. Loving our neighbor as ourselves is the royal law. And if we keep it, he says, you do well. You are to be commended for loving your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as a transgressor. In other words, if you show partiality, if you show racism, which by definition is a respecter of person based upon the color of their skin, then you are sinning, convicted by the very law to love your neighbor as yourself. You're not doing it. Racism is an attitude of partiality and prejudice. Racism demeans people, telling someone that they're inferior because they don't match my peer group. Racism drives a wedge in communities throughout the world, threatening to divide people who are stronger together than bickering and separated from one another. Racism curses those who are made in the very image of God. You remember in James chapter 3, as he's discussing sins of the tongue, he says that at one point you praise God, you bless God, and then out of the same mouth you curse others, you curse man, who are made in the likeness of God. To speak of a black race or a medium-toned skin or a white race person of being inferior to the one that you're a part of, that is to curse them. With the same mouth that you would pretend to praise God, you have cursed those that are made in the very image of God. American religious leaders led the charge to bring about the abolition of slavery and to bring about equality to all American citizens and bring about the civil rights movement. Sadly, the majority of Christendom, and I use that in its broadest, including anyone who names Christ, the majority, vast majority of Christendom did not join that cause. But without the few who did, segregation and racism might still be the norm today. So we are thankful for leaders like King and others that marched with him that laid the foundation of equality. Or we might say more accurately, that uncovered the foundation of equality that had been written into our precious founding documents from the very, very beginning of our country. Racism has been a blight throughout the world. It was a plague in our own country. And some have suggested that we need to make it right by turning the tables so that those who were on the receiving end of racism and hatred, the black race, that to make it right now, that the whites need to be prejudiced against, that racism toward the white man should prevail, at least for a little while, to balance things out. But look, racism is always wrong. It's always sinful. So those who advocate that today don't understand the blight that it is no matter what direction it's going. And the only way to make racism right is to stop it altogether and not try to make things balance. We have made great, wonderful, glorious strides in equality. And right now we stand on the right side of history, at least on this moral issue. But we must look out that we do not find ourselves on the wrong side of a moral issue again. American churches are heavily influenced by American culture. The segregation issue is just one example. We, as Church of Christ members, should have been the tip of the spear stabbing at the very heart of racism. Instead, we advocated it through silence or even vocal support. I believe the reason why we did is because of the overwhelming ideas of our American culture, that they influenced us in the wrong direction. So here's a question. What other social, moral issues do we face that might put us on the wrong side of history and time? One that I think of is abortion. It may be the next one. You know, I'm glad to see that more and more people today are distancing themselves from radical ideas on abortion, like late-term abortion and partial birth abortion, saying that there should be a limit on how late in the term of the pregnancy you can choose the abortion. Science is showing now through experimentation that babies, infants that are still in the womb, feel pain as early as 20 weeks. In fact, some studies have suggested and shown that these babies feel pain as early as 10 weeks. Even atheists, people who have no problem with the concept of abortion, are starting to backpedal, saying if these children can feel pain, maybe we shouldn't pull them apart and take them out of the womb. Maybe we should put limits on abortion itself. And what I think is that, or at least my hope is that this direction is going to eventually lead to an overturning or a reversal of the Roe v. Wade decision. What a great moral victory that would be to see Roe v. Wade overturned. But let's imagine ourselves on that day where we finally get our act together as a country and recognize the immorality that is surrounding abortion. Where will the church have been? What side will the church have been on in this issue? Will it have been on the side of years of silence, considering this a political issue that we just don't need to be involved in? Will we be on the side of years of casting votes for candidates that promise to keep abortion legal right up to the day of delivery? Will we be on the side that promotes and supports and encourages and demands that abortion mills throughout the country continue to stay open at taxpayer expense? You know, it took religious leaders becoming vocal, protesting, even going to prison for their stance against racism before the scales of the nation fell from our eyes. Is the church willing to be the tip of the spear now that kills abortion on demand, that strikes at its very heart? Are we willing to be on the side that supports pregnancy centers and at-risk women and adoption options for as alternatives to abortion? Are we willing to be on the side of supporting and voting for leaders who oppose abortion on demand and are vocal about it? Are we going to be on the side of those who are teaching and modeling abstinence and righteousness every single day? You know, on the judgment day, God will see that there is a right side of the abortion issue. Will we be on that side? Other issues may come up. I see that immigration is starting to become a very moral issue. How we deal with those who are coming to our country. We need to go to the Bible and take a biblical stance, not necessarily a political party on one side or the other, but a biblical stance on immigration, on transgenderism, on homosexuality, whatever the issue will be. You see, there will always be an overlap of moral and political issues. And we must make sure that we are biblical. It is the only way to be on the right side of history, is to be morally, biblically right and not follow society in popular opinions. Racial tension wasn't new in America during the civil rights movement. Race conflict was not new during slavery and abolition. Jesus faced poor race relations in the first century between Jews and Gentiles. They were constantly at conflict with one another. But through the cross, Jesus brought all people together as one. Paul writes in Ephesians 2, beginning in verse 14, "For he himself," that is Jesus, "for Jesus is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, and so making peace. He might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to you who were near." You see, Jesus in his life on this earth, preaching peace, trying to break down the hostility and the conflict between Jew and Gentile, reconciling both to God, but not as two separate entities, but bringing them together as one. and reconciling them to God. God created man as one unit, one race, one people. Man divided over prejudice and hatred. But the cross of Christ seeks to bring us back together, to reunite us as one, so that we might be saved by the grace of God. Brethren, we are so thankful for community leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King that helped sway social opinion toward God's revealed moral righteousness. But we are even more thankful for that revealed will of God that leads all of us to the right side of history. And it begins with making sure that our lives are on the right side of righteousness. That we have been saved by the blood of Christ, that we have obeyed the gospel and been baptized for the remission of our sins, and that we stand up for what is biblically right anytime, anywhere, that Jesus is always right. And if it goes against society and popular opinion, that's okay, because with God on our side, we cannot be wrong. If you're here tonight and you're ready to obey the gospel, you want to become part of God's family, all things are ready for you if you will come while we stand and while we sing.